talk about old school improvisation and whether you fit into this category of like the old school improviser, the Dizzies, the Stan Getzes, the idea that if they didn't hear it and they couldn't feel it, then they weren't going to play. And they were going to let the rhythm section come in and kind of create their own statement, but they were not going to force the issue if they didn't hear it. Can you talk about that old school improvisation, how it worked into your career?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I don't exactly fit that particular map. I'm a war baby. I was born in 1942. So my generation is kind of in betwixt and between the real old school of Dizzy and Benny Carter and other generations and the modern school. My whole approach is sort of, I mean, it wasn't a thought out approach, it's just the way it kind of worked out, was straddling. My first inspiration was swing music, Benny Goodman and Count Basie and Duke Ellington, and there was a lot of that around when I was a kid. But when I was growing up, the music that I was hearing was Sonny Rollins and John Coltrane, hard bop, and then later Herbie Hancock and Miles and more modern versions of bop, you might say. So I kind of had a broader expanse in my overall concept. However, the question you ask is very valid. Yes, feeling and hearing are always going to be the important signposts along the way. If you're not dealing with that, and I teach youngsters still to this day, I'm now 74, so I try and explain to them that hearing is maybe the most important element, not learning everybody's licks, not developing all the chops in the world, which everybody can do now. It apparently isn't that hard to do because people do it all the time.
Right.
But really hearing is something that's a lost art. And learning how to listen and respond. That's what I see that's missing. But beyond that, the old school guys, I once asked Stan, who was a kind of a friend of mine, and I'd interviewed him myself, and I asked him, how do you do it? Because every time he'd get up and play, it was like some kind of magic happening. He could play a C scale and make you cry. I mean, it was really, always that kind of a thing going on. And he says, you can't do it alone. You have to have, and he always had great bands, right? Miles always had great bands. I mean, not just adequate accompanists, great bands that listened, responded, and did new things, found new places to go with the music. And that seems to be what's not happening with a lot of young kids because they can't know what they don't know.
Stan Getz. And I wanted to ask you, being that you are somebody that plays the same instrument, obviously he was probably an idol. I just want you to talk about the first time that you met Stan, and also if you could talk a little bit about not so much his brilliance in improvisation and lyricism and his ballad playing, but like how you believe that he was affected by being on the road as in ninth grade with a guy like Teagarden, and then ultimately, just your relationship with Stan over time.
Sure. Have you had a chance to read my interview with him? It's on my website.
Well, no. I mean, I was going to get into that later because.
The first.
It's
my
phenomenal.
first question
phenomenal.
Out of the box with him was how did you develop that sound? Because that's the other area that I'm always fascinated. How does somebody develop an original voice? I think I have an identifiable voice on one, probably three instruments, but that's not the same as being a true original. I don't consider myself a true original. I just consider myself more of a guy that's absorbed a lot of influences and do what I do, and it comes out pretty much me because I can't really be anybody else. But I asked him, and he says, I went on the road with Jack Teagarden at 16, and Benny Goodman, and those guys had real sounds. We mixed the band on the bandstand. There was one microphone. You had to have a sound to blend with those guys. That made perfect sense. Hit it right home. In other words, if you're playing with everybody on a horn and they all know how to really make that horn resonate, get a sound. When I say sound, I think of it in capital letters parenthetically. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not, yeah, okay, man, I've got the latest hip equipment and I'm blowing and everything's cool. It's not cool. It's like, do you know really how to make any instrument sound right? Go for the truth of sound. And make your instruments sound true and your musical statements sound true. So that was his answer about that. So it's very important. My relationship with him personally, I mean, I heard him when I was a teenager playing with Jazz at the Phil with J.J. Johnson. And I think the perspective that I'd like to put out there is that at that time, there were many people that had individual sounds and styles. And he was one of them. He was one of the prime people that had an individual sound, even though he was obviously and confessed to being totally influenced by Lester Young, of course. He was not a clone. That was his sound. That was his phrasing. That's what made him as great as he really was. And he became one of the greats, and not only greats, but recognized as a original, unique voice on his instrument. And he was recognized financially for that, too. He made a lot of money just being Stan Getz. I got to know him at the Stanford Workshop when he was he became artist in residence there, and for several years, and I was still doing the workshops there, and we'd conduct the master classes. It was his master class, but I would be there helping him. And we would both kind of gang up on students. I remember Josh Redman was one of them, actually.
That's so awesome to know. No, I was going to say that I'm going to interview Jim Nadell this Friday. He was running that show over there, I think. But
right.
Yeah, so go ahead. You what were Stan? What were those master classes like? I mean, was he somebody who was he wasn't? I can't imagine him being a big lecturer.
Oh, he loved it, man. He got off on it. He went out and had a business. Jimmy will tell you. He went out and got a business card printed up. Said Stan Getz, artist in residence, Stanford Jazz Workshop. I mean, he just loved being there and talking to kids. It's a great environment, a great, venue, and but it wasn't all about ego with him. He was a real sweetheart of a guy. If you didn't work for him and you were we were always friends. I'd go visit him at the Keystone. I'd hang out with him, and he was just always really nice to me, and he really appreciated it. We were even on a record that Standard Oil produced of educational stuff. My band Listen and his band with Billy Hart and Jim McNeely, we were all recorded on the same album, not together playing, but on the same educational album.
Are you kidding?
And he's interviewed,
hold on.
and I'm interviewed.
Is that the horns or the brass one?
You familiar with the series?
I have used that as a name that tune with Michael Shreve. Got him.
Oh my God.
Okay, Marshy sent me all the vinyl of that stuff. I mean, it is the most eclectic.
Right, he was involved, right.
Yeah, but I'm going to say I didn't know that Stan was on the Woodwinds one.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's awesome.
He was.
Yeah, that
Indeed.
is Can you just go? I want you to talk. This is so fascinating. You said Tea Garden, those cats, one microphone. You had to have your own individual sound. Why?
Why?
Yeah.
Because they didn't have fancy audio equipment. And so it was a minimum. Even the old records are made with 1 and 2 microphones. Are you kidding?
I guess what I'm getting at is the idea of, like you talked about before, where the rub is people are trying to sound like people. Stan could have just sounded like someone, but I guess you're saying you needed to stand out in order to actually be heard on the recording?
No. What I'm saying, first of all, that's two different questions. People emulating other people, first of all, was pretty much a no-no. Yes, you could display influences if you were a Coleman Hawkins influenced tenor player, or if you were a Lester Young influenced tenor player, that was cool. But you didn't go out and just blatantly try and cop somebody's style because that was a hip thing to do. It wasn't hip at all, and it was frowned upon. I talked to Jerome Richardson and many other people about this at various times, and they said, no, if you consciously found yourself sounding exactly like somebody else, you had to change that shit right up on the spot because they'd be on you like white on rice, So there's that issue, but the issue of sound and mixing, the issue is acoustics. There's acoustics involved here. That's what's lost. Everybody says, "Oh, fix it in the mix," or "Give me more in my monitor," or whatever. Well, that's all fine and dandy. We have that equipment. It doesn't help you develop your sound. Play all night. I used to play in a club when I was, a teenager, playing for strippers and show people, and with just a trio, and it had one mic and a little teeny dinky amp and one speaker up on the wall that was completely blown out, of course. And that was it. And I had to play 5 nights a week, full volume, all night. Man, I'd come home, my ribs would hurt. But you know what? I developed that sound so that when I later on went to work in places, I had that at an early age. And that's benefited me ever since, I still can have that sound. And a student might come in now and hear me play a little. How do you do that? I say, that's a long story.
If you were going to compare Stan to an artist, a painter, or a sculptor, who would it be?
Oh, maybe the Impressionist school, pretty much.
Is there one in particular?
Debussy, Ravel, sure. He wasn't an avant-garde player in that sense. He wasn't psychedelia or psychedelic in that sense, although he had his moments, I know, based on other abuses.
Right.
Well, but that's another issue also. But yeah, I'd say he had a very soft, lyrical, musical approach. But it could also be hard-edged. As his later recordings, when he was really dying, and he did that duo thing with Kenny Barron on his last tour, that's some of the most hard-edged, emotional music I've ever heard. From him, for sure, and just from about anybody. But his sound was always known as smooth. He really was known, as the sound. Like Mel Torme was the Velvet Fog.
That's right. He had he had a few. He had Stanley Steamer. He got that from a Mulligan Getz session, and then eventually became known as the Sound. What I mean, in your as a saxophone player, what did you admire most about him? Obviously you worked with him in the Stanford.
I never played with him.
Never played with him, but what did
I wouldn't dream of it. I went and listened. I wouldn't ever dreamed of sitting in, and I sure as hell would never follow him after he played a ballad. Forget about it. Maybe if there's an influence of him. I've never been really heavily. I can do a studio imitation of him. Somebody asks, I can kind of get into a bossa nova or something like that. But really, if there's an influence on me that he had, it's that ballad thing. His cooking, he could cook, though, man. He could play uptown. Listen to the record with Dizzy. Don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. He can burn.
I think that one of the biggest things that's overlooked about him, because he did all the bossa stuff, was just I just got off the phone with Lalo Schifrin. Lalo basically said Dizzy compared him to Charlie Parker in the sense that not in this that they sounded the same, but the idea that Stan had added vocabulary to bebop in his own way, and that is, he was a monster player. There's that album For Musicians Only with him and Stitt and Diz and Kenny's. I've interviewed 40 Cats already, but I just as somebody who played, like Liebman. Dave Liebman said that he was too obsessed with Coltrane at the time. Stan was sort of an acquired taste for him. He considered it snoozy, the bossa stuff.
There's a lot of people that from a different era that think that he had a crappy sound, when it's not true. Billy Hart would tell you, who played with both Stan and Joe Henderson, he said, man, Stan had a much bigger sound than Joe Henderson. And he did. He'd play acoustic and fill the room. And one of the things he pointed out to me was that's what he learned to do early on, is fill every nook and cranny of the room with his sound. Not just the edge of the sound, not just a projection of the sound, but the literal resonance of the sound throughout a room. That's the old school magic trick that most people never get to. It's metaphysical.
Can you please keep riffing on that? The Alpha State was there with Stan, the Focus, but what is that? How do you go to the metaphysical? What is the trick? Not the answer.
Well, it's not really even a trick. It's Okay, I went and heard as a child or as a teenager Les Brown and his band Renown playing at the Senator Hotel in Sacramento, and they had a guy named Freddie Waters. I'll never forget this, Freddie Waters, and he was a known L.A. saxophonist that could do real good work, and he was featured on tenor, and he came out and played a solo in front of a big band with no microphone, and he filled the room with his sound. And it was a big room. It was a ballroom. That's what I'm talking about. That's the old school thing that I'm talking about. Guys knew how to get the maximum tone. And it's not just about playing loud. It's about projecting their sound, their total sound. Again, not just the front edge of their sound, but their total sound. When I just say sound, I have to define that as including all the parameters of the sound, all the resonance. You technically you can look at a sound on an oscilloscope and see what those look like, but that's not going to give you the full thing. So it goes beyond just physics. That's where it gets into metaphysics. It goes beyond that. Yes, there's the alpha state, there's projecting all kinds of magical things, and Stan had all of that, no question. That's why I asked him, how do you do it? I wanted to know, really, and he just distilled it down into a few words, like you don't do it alone. Well, that implies not only on the bandstand, but all the people that helped him and all the people he did it with in his history. You dig? So it goes a long way into how that happens. It's no single trick that I can point to and just say, now if you do this and do that, you can go out and make it sound like that. That ain't going to happen. It comes from all your experiences, everything that you've been taught, everything you've experienced with other players, and the examples that have been shown you.
Stan was such a complex human being. I mean, a lot of the musicians don't talk out of school. Some do. His family wore the scars of his insanity at home at the mansion in Irvington. But I mean, what did you take away from that interview? It was very, very great interview.
Well, I was writing for a magazine called the Saxophone Journal, which is more of an educator's magazine. You've had a lot of journals out there. The doctors have journal magazines and so forth and so on. They had one for saxophone, and a lot of the educators wrote for us. And also Liebman and I were writing for it, among other people. So they'd also have professional musicians, and we were paid writers, literally. I never really had that much experience before, but it turned out I had a talent for being able to put my thoughts into writing. And at the same time, I was doing those things with Stan at Stanford and getting to know him at the Keystone and things like that. So I told the editor, I said, look, I'd like to interview Stan Getz. And he said, absolutely. So we made some overtures to Stan. I just asked him, and he was actually, Stan was in a place where he had been through all that other crazy stuff, and he was starting to come around. That's why he liked being an artist in residence. He was actually trying to atone, let's say, for past sins and find a more positive way to proceed with his life, I think. So he liked me, and he respected me as a musician, and he was very open and welcoming. My wife came and took pictures. He was very lovely to her. And so he was just open, and I was an idiot as far as interviews. He was my first actual interview. I've since interviewed many other people. So I had a list of questions, and as an interviewer, you don't carry crib notes and lists of interviews. You want to develop a conversation with the person you're talking to so you get some rapport.
Exactly.
So he saw me there with my legal pad full of questions, and he was very patient. He did not throw me out of the house. His girlfriend at the time said, if he doesn't like you, he's been known to throw interviews out of the house.
Well, I mean, his unpredictability, but no, that to me, well, he respected you, obviously, and he knew, so
he allowed me to ask him, but my questions were good, and the interview turned out really well, because I did understand, and he got that I understood where he was coming from and who he really was. And from our relationship as well. So he already trusted me with that. Trust is everything in that kind of situation. You know that.
I know, you're right.
So, it worked out really, really well. And he was in the right place for it. That's what I'm trying to say in his own life. in an earlier incarnation, he might have been very impatient with somebody like me.
Do you remember the first time you actually saw him in person?
I say when I was a teenager with Jazz at the Phil with J.J. Johnson. I don't quite remember who else was in the band.
Or do you remember the albums that you? I mean, did
well,
you?
Focus was a monumental.
And
achievement.
explain, because this is really important, because Bird did his thing with strings, but some people say that he was just sort of blowing and not necessarily.
Yeah, he was just doing one thing he did.
Right, but how was Focus in your mind? Why was it a seminal album?
Well, it's an innovative album, don't you think?
I want you.
I mean, he did things nobody had ever done. Most of that's improvised. There is no. I asked the publishers of that music. They have it online. You can buy the arrangements. I said, "Could you send me the saxophone part?" And they said, "There is no saxophone part."
Wow.
So all that he played was so great and so lyrical that was all made up on the spot. And there's things to his mother, the chart Her, for his mother who had just passed away during the making of the album. I mean, it was a